Hughie, first of all, I just wanted to say what a privilege it is to be able to speak to you about your printmaking practice. I am going to also be referencing your painting because I understand that they're closely entwined.
Yes.
So it isn't going to be strictly about prints and printmaking, but I think mostly. And I'm going to start with just a very broad question. I wonder if you could just speak to the place of printmaking in your practice over the course of your career. I mean, I understand you've had periods of intense but sporadic engagement with it. So just what impels you towards or away from printmaking?
Well, it's a very good question because how you get involved in an activity like printmaking is not obvious. I am a painter. That was my first impetus as an artist. I was interested in paint, and I was pretty hopeless, I think, at lino cutting when I was at school. Didn't make much of an impression, but when I was working in Italy, in Florence in 1986, with a gallery called Carini, there was they also had a stamper in a place called San Giovanni Valdarno, which is where Masaccio was born. And they made prints by Italian artists, and they're actually still there. I was there this last summer. They still have a print workshop there in San Giovanni Valdarno, and they work with, it's slightly different now. In those days it was much more hands-on, printing with etching plates, and now it's much more digitally driven, should I say. They work with people like Alex Katz, who they get an image from down the line, and they're working. So that was my first contact with printmaking. I made my first etching, which was quite a large-scale etching, really. It was a reckless project in many ways. It's called A View of the City of Toledo, which is it references El Greco's painting of Toledo, which I'd made a drawing of when I was working at the National Gallery. And I was lost. I was all at sea, basically. I didn't know how to work with the print. But I worked with the printer there, a man called Valerio Carini, and so it was a slow process of getting to know what you were doing. And I suppose it highlighted the initial problem for me, which was that I was a painter, and the printer gave me this needle to work with. Now, I normally work with a paintbrush, which is a big sort of, lots of hairs on the end of it, and I got a needle to work with, scratching into wax, and so that was where I had lots of problems. However, the process of engaging with that it's been a long process from moving from that to making what I would say probably nowadays are more painterly prints. I've learned more about the process of printmaking. I don't have a press in my studio. I've never wanted to have a press in my studio, actually. I do work with master printers who spend all their time printing, and I was talking to one today out of the blue, came to see me today, and often the process of printing is driven by the master printer, who wants you to come to his workshop to realise something you've done in print, to realise it in a slightly different form. And that's part of the attraction, that always has been to artists, to make something that's unique, more accessible to a larger audience, to make something that's not the same, but is an equivalent. And suppose that goes back to my first introduction, whereas I'm struggling to try and make something an equivalent, and I'm working with this little scratchy etching needle instead of a paintbrush. And so my career as a printmaker has been about trying to establish this equivalence in terms of what I do as a painter, my vision, if you'd like, in printed form. And hopefully over 30 years I've become slightly more sophisticated.
Well, that actually leads quite beautifully into my next question, which is about the relationship between your practice as a painter and your practice as a printmaker. And I'm particularly interested in this because I actually attended another conversation with an artist last week who is both an artist who's both a painter and a printmaker, and he was asked which one he found more difficult? And I'm not going to give the game away by saying which one, what his answer was. But I'm just wondering if you could maybe elaborate more on how these two sides of your practice feed each other,
Absolutely.
or whether indeed they act in opposition to one another.
It's a movable feast, I have to say, because sometimes, and in my early prints, the most obvious difference was one of scale, in that the prints looked like miniature versions of my paintings. They didn't have an equivalence to the paintings in terms of their scale. In the most obvious example of this would be that in my paintings, as far back as 1983 or 82 even, my references to the human figure has always been at scale, at the same scale as the human figure. So if there's a painting of a head, it's at least this big. And whereas in the prints, that first print I mentioned, The View of Toledo, it references El Greco's painting, which is actually El Greco's painting of the Laocoon, which is Toledo, but it has a horse in it, and the horse is miniature. So scale is different, and that was something I found difficult. I wanted to work to change, to achieve a more equivalent scale in my painting. But more complex than that, the figure, and this image that's here is actually about scale of the print itself. This is a print, it's a colour Carborundum print. It's a swimming figure, it's a bit frog-like form, but it's a swimming figure at the top of the painting that is in the whites. And it's made basically in two parts, and it mimics something that I would have done in my painting from this period. In an oil painting, the white areas of the print would be a kind of quite viscous, oily paint, rich surface, and the blues representing the kind of water, I think it's called night swimming, would be made in layers of oil paint. And so in the print, I had to kind of pull things apart and deconstruct what I was doing. And how I did that was to make it in essentially two parts. One part of the print carries drawing, and the drawing in this case is in a blue-black. And the drawing lines, you can see they're made with a paintbrush rather than a needle. And this is Carborundum etching, which is a different process. I won't get into the detail of that, but it allows me to use a brush rather than a needle, and that carries the drawing. And that was made in this case on an aluminium plate. And it was also made in my studio, which is a significant difference from being made in a printer's studio. Then the colour was added with the same medium, Carborundum medium, but really it's done in overlay, and that was done on transparent Perspex sheets, so I could make the registration of the colours. And the colour, I think, was printed first, so one series of plates had the blue and the oranges and the yellows or whatever's in the print, and one series of plates printed secondly had the colour. And Carborundum, because of its nature, embosses the paper, so it impresses into the paper. So it has some of the qualities that my paintings have. So it's closer in feel to what the paintings are like. But to answer the question, Rachel, more specifically, sometimes printing drives a new subject. Mm-hmm. Sometimes printing follows painting. The best example of printing driving a new subject is a series of prints I made called A Line of Retreat, which was about my father's experience in France in 1940, and I just started from imagination, pure and simple, and I made a series of 10 prints that were kind of a poetic response to certain things he'd told me about his experience in 1940, and so and I was working with the printers, and there would be a lot of interchange. They'd say, why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Have you thought of that? And so there was a kind of collaborative, creative dimension to that. And those were the kind of first, they then affected the paintings I made. And that's very exciting when that happens, because it's a different process, and it loosens you up in a way, and it stops this kind of, we're all habit forming by nature, and so the relationship is constantly shifting.
Thank you. That was really fascinating, and actually the parallels between your response to that question and the other artist whom I heard speak last week, who was Tom Hammock, were really fascinating. He actually he also said that that he found printmaking often drives new innovation, and he found painting actually much harder because there are no rules.
Yes.
In a way that there isn't with printmaking.
Yes.
But one of the things I found really fascinating about your work is that I noticed that sometimes you actually combine painting and printmaking within a single piece. And for example, in your Fall of France series, and I'm just wondering about what blurring the boundaries between painting and printmaking like this, what does that bring to the work that something that is just a painting or just a print might not possess?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there's no rules, and in painting there are no rules, because as soon as we establish rules, things become boring and they become predictable, and I think artists often by nature are often looking to sort of establish rules, because none of us actually like to be in a very sort of uncomfortable position. We'd like to know what we're doing, but unfortunately I'm in a profession where I don't know what I'm doing, and that is the gold standard actually of being a painter, is that you don't know what you're doing. And that's sometimes something that's very difficult to understand, because our culture, the visual culture that we live in, has been dominated by conceptual art for a long time, and conceptual art is based on the premise that the only thing that's important in a work of art is the idea, which is clearly a ludicrous idea, but nevertheless has been embraced right across the board, and so we've reached a point where we expect to actually be able to understand something without actually encountering it, and that's obviously can't be it's not true, but it's to do with a very limited understanding of how meaning is achieved. And I think painting establishes meaning in a different way to other things. It's a particular language, and meaning accrues in the process of painting. You can't just say, well, this painting, I'm going to make a painting, it's going to mean this, and do it, because the painting would be an illustration of this other thing, and good painting is never an illustration of anything. So the painting needs to grow and kind of draw to itself certain things. So my process of making a work of art is kind of like a blind man feeling his way around, to try and find some meaning and so I'm open to all processes. The work that's on the screen at the moment, it would be an apt case in point, which is something I discovered in a car boot sale in County Kilkenny in Ireland many years ago now, but it was an old box of glass plate negatives taken in Ireland at the turn of the century, around about 1907, 1908, 1909, and they were amongst a lot of tools on the floor, I picked this box up and I could see it was glass plate negative. I didn't look at it. I said, what do you want for this? And he said what he wanted. I took them off and I looked at them. I found them quite interesting, but it took a period of about 5 or 6 years afterwards that this gestation period, I had an idea about making a sequence of works that were about a kind of really strong motif in Irish culture, which is emigration, and the parable of the prodigal son, the biblical story, but in Irish culture often has a resonance about people having to leave home and go away. And so I constructed a narrative where these old images, which had kind of lost their context and lost their meaning, were drafted into this new narrative about, I involved people like my grandfather in it, people who I knew, brought it in close to me and made a sequence of paintings, and also a text, because I wanted to control the textual element of the story as well. So lots of things feed in to the process of making a work of art, and I think there's a natural instinct always to want something to be, to know, to control things, but I think the natural condition of an artist is to be in a slightly uncertain place, and to draw inspiration and to try and give form to something that sometimes is difficult to express, or almost impossible to express until you've actually done it. I can talk about my work after the event much more easily than I can. Well, I can't really talk about it very well when I'm making it, because as I say, I don't know what I'm doing, and that's a plus in my profession.
Definitely. I wanted to ask a bit more about technique. I know you've experimented with a number of different techniques over the course of your career as a printmaker, from starting with etching, and now you're fairly, I think fairly anchored in Carborundum. And I just wondered whether the choice of technique affects or influences your choice of subject matter, or vice versa. You've already said a bit about the attraction of the Carborundum method for you, that it produces very painterly prints, but yeah. Is there anything else that has particularly drawn you to that?
Well, I was very resistant to Carborundum when it was shown to me initially. Printers will say to you, "Have you tried this? Have you tried?" And Carborundum it was a bit like, Carborundum is a kind of an abrasive grit that you can get in various consistencies, thin, thick, coarse, and it was always used to me like, it always looked like porridge, which I had bad memories of as a child. But it just visually wasn't really, it was used as a kind of textural effect, and I was very resistant to using Carborundum. But anyway, at some point I gave way to that and made a print in black and white, which is often a way that artists make something. They have to return something very basic in order to understand how it works. And so I made a print in black and white, and I thought, I understand this more. But what's extraordinary about Carborundum to me, and I should technically say, basically it was invented in the 20th century. It was, whether it was invented in America, Europe is a moot point, but it's this abrasive grit. So if you imagine an etching plate, you have a wax coating, and you scratch away the wax and the acid bites, and then that's the line. In Carborundum, what you do is you have a clean, smooth plate, which you paint the grit in an acrylic medium and allow it to dry, and this grit holds ink. So where you paint the line, it holds the ink. And what I found, how it worked for me, was if I made the consistency of paint like the paint I would use on a painting, that it printed like this. With the skill of the printer, the correct pressure on the plate, on the press, this raised level of on the plate actually embosses the print, so you get almost like the texture of the painting in reverse, whereas on a painting the surface rises up. In a Carborundum print, it's impressed in, but it's virtually the same feeling. So for me, it had an empathetic quality to the paintings I was making. Does it influence subject matter? No, it doesn't, because Subject matter is something I actually probably don't have much choice about. I don't wake up one day and think, oh, I'll do some paintings of the seaside, or I'll do this, or I'll do... subject matter is absolutely driven by what I need to do, and my work is, if I was to stand outside it and say, well, what is it about? It's looking for, it's kind of searching for some kind of meaning in, so that the subjects are often quite sort of serious subjects, and they often follow narratives, stories of people's lives. I've painted battles, I've painted lots of stories, which again is something that's kind of largely disappeared in 20th century art because it was so formal. And so it doesn't drive subject matter, but what it does do is it perhaps enables you to see subject matter slightly differently, and to change the emphasis, or the kind of the emphasis that you place in the work.
And I just wanted to start by asking about other printmakers you have looked to as models or as an inspiration. I know Rembrandt was one of your early inspirations, as he was for many printmakers. But are there any others who are particular touchstones for your
Well,
work?
I'm very influenced by other works from the tradition of art. I'm influenced by things that move me, and Rembrandt actually. The first paintings, oil paintings I made, were copies of paintings by Rembrandt. They were made from reproductions, and so Rembrandt was an artist who immediately interested me. And Rembrandt's, not really the content, but I think the tonality, the tonal range of Rembrandt, really I found interesting, this sort of immense tonal range. And so in my early prints, that was something that I was interested, because these are kind of timeless things. I mean, tone is always going to be engaging to us, you know, and colour and line and form. So influences I have embraced. I think in the 20th century or 21st century, there's been a kind of ridiculous emphasis on the idea of originality at all costs, that what you do. It's led to some of the most trivial and vacuous artwork that has been produced, because and it's part of the legacy of modernism, that we prize the new, the different. It's got to be different. It's got to be new, and so we prize this to an extraordinary extent. Whereas, in a way, what I think is interesting is not skill or technique, but the authenticity, the authentic vision. So I have been influenced by other artists. In some ways, I'm like a sponge. When I see something good, I remember it. I look at it, take it in. Whether it's in 1980, looking at a George Baselitz woodcut at the Whitechapel Art Gallery when I'd just come down to London, a very rough, ready wood, with a lino print actually. It was about 8 foot tall, but I remembered it, seen, taken in, remembered, whether it's Rembrandt, the tonality in Rembrandt, but this is something that's self-evidently obvious. I've been looking in great depth and detail at the work of Vincent van Gogh recently, who's a towering figure, very difficult man, very sort of troubled individual, and if you read his letters or you read anything about him and you engage with him, his humility is an incredible sort of lesson for any artist. And Van Gogh, when he was recovering from his attack, where he was in the asylum in Saint-Rémy, he spent his time copying works by Millet, Delacroix, Rembrandt. This was an artist, one of the most extraordinary, lightning bolt, revolutionary artists in the 19th century, who was content to make copies of works by who we now consider much inferior artists, and content to make copies from works of the Illustrated London News. An extraordinary thing, because it's not, we think about influence in a very narrow way. All good artists are influenced. We can't contain all the sort of knowledge of humanity, and so we draw on examples, and Van Gogh's influences are myriad, too myriad for me to list, but he produced the most original paintings of the second half of the 19th century, and one etching, I think, of Dr. Gachet, but it's brilliant. Mm. And so influence, I think, is a very positive thing. We've learned to be very suspicious of it, because it's often been, you know, the typical art school tutorial will be, oh, that's a bit derivative of this, or it's derivative of that. For God's sake, painters have to be, in the past they had to be derivative to learn their profession. So, don't know if that makes any sense. But,
absolutely, it's kind of a truism to say that no artist, you know, works or creates in a vacuum. But I think this fetishization of originality, we tend to forget that. That's one of the things I feel makes your work so incredibly rich, is the way that you've actually actively embraced the work of past masters. I believe you once explicitly positioned yourself against Lucian Freud's refusal of quote unquote tyranny of the past, and yeah, it's this engagement with the history of art and with history in general, as if the two could be separated. Yes. I think it's fair to say is absolutely key to your work. Your experience as artist in residence at the National Gallery for 2 years.
Well, it was a great opportunity at the National Gallery, and it came at a very, like most things in life that mean a lot. The timing was perfect. I nearly didn't bother applying for the residency, but it was a very privileged position to be in at the National Gallery. You had a studio in the basement of the National Gallery, and part of the idea was that to bring a contemporary visual artist into this great sort of storehouse of old masters, so that people would probably say, well, actually, this thing is not just made by dead people; it's still being made. That art is being made by artists now. But at that time, in the 1980s, mid-80s, there was a revival of painting, but most of the painting that was referencing the past was doing it through a veneer of irony, which really was kind of poking fun at the tradition. And that, there's reasons for that, and there's very good reasons for it, but by 1980 it actually become very tired. Irony grew out of the First World War in the visual arts. Started in Switzerland in 1916, 1917. At the lowest point in the 20th century, bar the Holocaust, was when the great battles of the Somme and Verdun were being fought, and people were being slaughtered on an industrial scale. And so it's not surprising that the art of the time blew away all these things that were held dear: religion, monarchies, beauty in art became a kind of perversity. It was quite understandable why that happened. But by 1980, mid-1985, that was not any longer the case. It's a bit like a joke that's being retold so many times that it's become, impossible to do anything other than irony. And that was a bit of the environment at Goldsmiths College that I encountered at Goldsmiths College in the 1980s. That the only ticket in town was irony. You just had to do irony, and I wasn't interested in irony because what I was interested in was some of the things that these profound works of art contained. And so when I had the opportunity to take a residency at the National Gallery, that was a difficult time, but it was a profoundly influencing time. And I walked around that gallery for 2 hours every day for a long time, had access to it at any particular time I wanted. And so I grounded my work in this tradition. But what I didn't take out of it was style, any particular style or way of working. What moves me here in this work, what's this about? And it certainly wasn't about irony. And I suppose the project in my own work became about how you could reintroduce some kind of seriousness and real feeling into painting, because you have to think that's absolutely against the background of somebody like Andy Warhol being absolutely at the top of the tree, and now somebody like Jeff Koons. Everything is done through a veneer of irony, and so. But if you think about it, in 1916, nobody believing in anything is quite. You can empathise with that. Why nobody believed in anything when people were being sent to die in their hundreds of thousands on the Western Front for what? Why would you believe in anything? But 1980, 1990, we've moved on a little bit. So I think irony has outstayed its welcome, particularly for me. And we're now at a time when really art can aspire to something a little bit more ambitious, I think. I
wanted to ask in a bit more detail about a particular work by one of the old masters that has really kind of run as a thread through a lot of your work, and that's the figure of Marsyas, whom I believe you encountered in a painting by Titian at the Royal Academy.
Yeah.
And he's a figure who just crops up again and again, and I just wondered if you could maybe speak about. Yeah, I mean the significance of this figure and how it might have metamorphosed over time.
Okay, well that's Marsyas is quite. A number of things connects with me. When I was at the National Gallery, there was an exhibition called The Genius of Venice. It was at the Royal Academy. At this painting of the Flaying of Marsyas by Titian, which had been hidden away in a monastery, I think in Czechoslovakia, Kroměř. The Archbishop's Palace there came out. In fact, it's in the catalogue, but it's not even reproduced in colour. It's in black and white. But at the Royal Academy, everybody who saw it, this painting was a dramatic thing. Presents the figure of Marsyas, who's a mythical story of a satyr who has a musical contest with the god Apollo, and he loses his skin, and the painting is a strange painting, because if you tell the story of the painting, it sounds slightly ridiculous, but basically the satyr's body is in the centre of the picture. It's hung from a tree, and the painting had a profound formal effect on my development. They say that oil painting was invented to paint human flesh. Well, late Titian is as good as it gets, and this is one of the great late Titians. It's a mysterious painting. It's about human suffering. It's as relevant about the Holocaust as it is about the myth. It's about a number of things. So it has influenced me. It's cropped up in my work. The other particular reference to it is that Marsyas was a flute player, and so was my father. And I did a lot of work about his experience in the Second World War, and particularly in relation to the Battle of Monte Cassino, which he was involved in, and curiously enough lost his flute or his piccolo in the Rapido River when he was in 1944 in the Battle of Cassino. So it's a personal reference, but it's a universal reference. And to make it as very simple as possible, it puts the human at the centre of things. So it's the opposite to irony. It puts the actual human condition in the centre of things. And You mentioned earlier about Freud's reference to the tyranny of memory. It's quite interesting. I think Freud's comment also has to be seen in the context of the fact that he's a refugee from Vienna, and Frank Auerbach is a refugee from Berlin, and they escape this horrendous thing, and they tend to focus on exactly what's in front of them. They don't look behind them. Mm-hmm. Whereas I'm of a different generation, and who benefited from the events of the Second World War.